The humidity of Seoul in late August usually felt like a damp wool blanket. But as Julia Thompson stepped off the private Gulf Stream at Incheon International Airport, the air seemed to chill in her presence. At 55, Julia didn't just occupy space, she commanded it. Her hair was pulled back, and her suit, a sharp midnight navy silk, was tailored with such lethal precision it looked like armor. She didn't look like a woman who had been broken 10 years ago. She looked like the woman who had come to collect the debt. "The car is waiting, Miss Thompson," her associate, a nervous young man named Mike, whispered. He'd worked for her for 3 years and had never seen her blink twice at a tragedy. To the legal world, she was the executioner. She didn't settle. She dismantled. Julia pulled on her dark glasses, her reflection in the terminal's glass windows momentarily haunting her. 10 years. She had left the city bleeding, carrying a secret beneath her heart and a hole in her soul. Now, she was the lead strategist for Vanguard Legal, hired by a conglomerate with one specific goal, the hostile takeover of Xinhua Holdings. "Let's go," she said, her voice a low, resonant cello note. "I have a city to burn." Across the Han River, in a penthouse that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, Kang Eun-suk sat in the dark. He was 55, but the silver at his temples made him look like a man who had lived 3 lifetimes. He was the CEO of the decade, the man who had stabilized the merger that saved his family's legacy. He had everything: the power, the skyline view, the respect of every board member in Asia. And he was utterly, profoundly dead inside. He reached for a crystal tumbler of hibiki, his movements mechanical. His marriage to the daughter of the Hansung Group, the woman his father had chosen, had ended in a quiet, sterile divorce 3 years prior. No children, no scandals, just a business contract that had reached its expiration date. The wall-to-wall television was muted, playing the evening financial news. Yoon-sok rarely watched it. He lived the news before it was reported. But a name scrolled across the ticker that stopped his heart mid-beat. Vanguard Legal appoints Julia Thompson as lead counsel for Seoul restructuring. Yoon-sok froze. The glass stayed halfway to his lips. It couldn't be. The screen cut to a live feed of the Incheon arrivals gate. The camera zoomed in on a woman walking through a phalanx of reporters. She didn't stop for questions. She didn't smile. She simply looked into the lens for a fraction of a second, a gaze so piercing, so full of cold, calculated fire, that Eun-suk felt the air leave his lungs. She was more beautiful than she had been at 45. The softness was gone, replaced by a terrifying, regal brilliance. He remembered the last time he saw her, the stage scene in his hotel suite, the hired woman draped over him, the look of utter destruction on Julia's face before she turned and ran into the rain. He had died that night, too. He had done it to stop his father from destroying her life, from disbarring her, from making her disappear. He had broken her to keep her alive. The crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. The expensive whiskey bled into the grout, but Eun-suk didn't move. He didn't call for a maid. He just stared at the screen, his hand trembling, the first crack in his iron composure in over 3,000 days. "Julia," he whispered, the name tasting like ash and hope. He didn't know that she was here to ruin him. He didn't know that 10 miles away, in a luxury hotel suite, a 10-year-old boy with Yoon-suk's exact brow and Julia's stubborn chin was opening a laptop, looking at a photo of the Xinhua building. The ghost was no longer in the glass. She was at his front door. The boardroom of Xinhua Holdings was a cathedral of glass and ego, perched on the 88th floor overlooking a sprawling, gray-skied Seoul. Kang Eun-suk stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the clouds. He had spent the last hour adjusting his tie, checking the placement of the water carafes, and rehearsing 1,000 versions of hello. Would she slap him? Would she scream? Part of him, the part that had been starving for a decade, hoped she would do both. Anything was better than the silence he had lived in since 45. The double mahogany doors swung open. The air in the room didn't just shift, it vanished. Julia Thompson walked in, followed by a phalanx of junior associates who moved like a school of sharks behind a great white shark. She didn't look at the view. She didn't look at the art. She sat at the head of the table, the seat usually reserved for the chairman, and laid a leather-bound folder on the polished wood. Yoon-sok turned, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Julia," he breathed, the name involuntary, a prayer whispered in a cold yard. Julia didn't look up. She was busy adjusting her tablet. "Good morning," she said, her voice crisp and entirely devoid of melody. "I believe we are here to discuss the fiduciary failures regarding the Hansung merger. Are we waiting for anyone else, or can we begin the dismantling?" Yoon-sok flinched. The word dismantling felt pointed. He walked toward the table, his legs feeling heavy. "It has been 10 years, Julia. Perhaps we could take 5 minutes to—" "To what, Mr. Kang?" She finally looked at him. Her eyes, once warm like mahogany, were now 2 polished stones. There was no recognition in them, no flickering ghost of the woman who used to read him poetry in the middle of the night. She looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a tumor, with clinical interest and a plan for extraction. "We are here on behalf of the minority shareholders," she continued, her tone dismissive. "I am Julia Thompson, lead counsel for Vanguard. You are the CEO of a company currently hemorrhaging trust. Let's keep our focus on the balance sheets, shall we?" "Mr. Kang." The formal address was the first blood drawn. It cut deeper than any insult. He sat opposite her, his hands trembling beneath the table. He watched her move, the way she tilted her head, the way she tucked a stray curl of hair behind her ear. It was her, and yet it wasn't. She was a masterpiece painted over with ice. For the next 2 hours, she systematically tore apart the work of his life. She knew every weakness in his contract. She had found the hidden debt structures he tried to bury to protect the employees. She was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly a stranger. "This merger is dead on arrival, Mr. Kang," she concluded, snapping her folder shut. The sound echoed like a gavel. "I'll have my team send over the divestment terms by EOD. I suggest you read them. They aren't suggestions." She stood up, her team rising in a choreographed wave. "Julia, please," Yoon-sok said, standing so quickly his chair scraped harshly against the floor. "Stay. Just for a moment. Let me explain." She paused, her hand on the door handle. She didn't turn around. "There is nothing to explain to a stranger, Mr. Kang. I'm here for the assets. Everything else? It's just noise." The Grand Hyatt, 4 p.m. While Julia was drawing blood in the boardroom, the noise was sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the presidential suite. Leo was 10 years old, and he was currently bored. He had finished his advanced calculus workbook 20 minutes early and was now staring out at the Namsan Tower. He reached up, a subconscious habit, and began to tap his ring finger against his thumb, a rhythmic 3-beat cadence. It was the exact same nervous tick Kang Eun-sok had used during the entire boardroom meeting 3 miles away. The boy turned when the door opened. Julia walked in, her shoulders finally dropping an inch. The executioner mask didn't fall, but it cracked. "How was the meeting, Mom?" Leo asked. His voice was soft, but he spoke with a precision that mirrored his mother's. Julia looked at him, and for the first time that day, her eyes softened. She walked over and brushed his hair back from his forehead. It was thick, black, and had a stubborn cowlick at the temple, the exact same cowlick that Yoon-sok fought every morning in the mirror. "It was productive," Julia said, her voice tight. "Did you meet the man?" Leo asked, his dark, almond-shaped eyes that were a perfect genetic bridge between a woman from Chicago and a man from Seoul, searching hers. "The CEO?" Julia turned away, walking toward the window to hide the sudden shimmer of moisture in her eyes. "I met a businessman, Leo. That's all he is." Leo nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He turned back to his laptop, the screen reflecting a photo of the Xinhua Holdings logo. He looked so much like the man she had just tried to destroy that it made Julia's lungs ache. She had come to Seoul for justice, but as she looked at her son, she realized she had brought the one thing that could either end the war or burn them all to the ground. The air in the penthouse of the Shilla Hotel was thick with the scent of lilies and cold ambition. Choi Min-hee, the woman the world knew as the former empress of Xinhua Holdings, sat on a velvet chaise longue, her eyes fixed on a tablet. She was the merger bride, the woman Yoon-suk had been forced to marry to save his empire. Their divorce 3 years ago had been a strategic retreat, not a surrender. She still held 10% of the company's stock and 1,000% of its secrets. "She looks better than she did when she was crying in that hotel room," Min-hee whispered, her voice like silk over a blade. She flicked her finger across the screen, zooming in on Julia Thompson's face during the morning's news cycle. Opposite her sat Mr. Beck, a man whose face was so unremarkable he could disappear in a room of 2 people. He was the shadow fixer, the man the elite hired when they didn't want a paper trail, only a result. "She's a ghost, madam," Beck said softly, "and ghosts are usually seeking one thing." "Retribution," Min-hee finished. She stood up, her floor-length silk robe trailing behind her like a spill of oil. 10 years ago, we broke her. We made sure she left Seoul with nothing but her shame. Now she's back with the power of a global firm behind her, and Yoon-suk looks like he's seen a miracle instead of a threat. Find the crack in her armor, Beck. Every woman has one. Is it money? A lover? A scandal? "I'll start with her time in the States," Beck bowed. "No one disappears that well without a reason." While Min-hee plotted her defense, Julia was orchestrating an apocalypse. The hotel suite was no longer a place of rest. It was a command center. Papers were taped to the floor-to-ceiling windows, obscuring the view of the city with a web of corporate hierarchies and offshore account numbers. "Mike," Julia said, not looking up from a stack of tax records, "tell the New York office to trigger the audit on the Xinhua Cultural Foundation." "The charity?" Mike blinked. "That's a public relations nightmare, Julia. They'll come for us with everything they have." "Let them come," Julia said, a predatory smile touching her lips. "The foundation is the chairman's pride. It's where they hide the donations that pay for their lobbyists. I don't just want to take their money, Mike. I want to take their reputation. I want the name Kang to be synonymous with fraud by the time the sun sets on Friday." She was planting legal bombs, complex, multi-layered lawsuits that would go off in sequence. First, the foundation. Then, the labor violations in their Ulsan plant. Finally, the inheritance tax evasion that would strip the family of their majority voting rights. She was a surgeon with a scalpel, and she was cutting straight for the heart of the dynasty that had deemed her unworthy. Leo sat at the small dining table, his noise-canceling headphones on, but his eyes were wide and observant. He watched his mother move. He had seen her like this before, focused, intense, but never this vicious. He pulled up a window on his laptop that his mother hadn't authorized. He was a child of the digital age, and he had his own ways of protecting his mother. He had hacked into the Hyatt's internal security feed. He saw a man in a gray suit, Mr. Bake, lingering in the lobby, showing a photo of Julia to the concierge. Leo didn't panic. He didn't tell his mother. He knew she was busy fighting a war. Instead, he opened a clean coding terminal and began to run a facial recognition search on the man in the gray suit. If they are looking for her, Leo thought, his small jaw tightening in a mirror image of the man he didn't know was his father, they'll have to find me first. Late that night, Julia stood on the balcony, the wind whipping her hair loose from its tight bun. She looked down at the lights of Seoul. Somewhere down there, Yoon-suk was probably sitting in his glass cage, haunted by her return. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a small, tarnished silver coin, a lucky charm Eun-suk had given her on their first trip to Jeju Island. She had kept it for 10 years. "You should have fought for me," she whispered into the wind. Her phone buzzed, a message from an encrypted number. "Unknown. The audit is live. The first bomb has dropped." Julia watched as, across the city, the lights in the Xinhua headquarters suddenly flickered on, floor by floor. The panic had begun. The executioner had arrived, and she wasn't just there to win. She was there to leave nothing but ashes. The Xinhua headquarters was a monolith of steel and ego, its lobby a cavernous expanse of white marble designed to make the average person feel small. Leo Thompson did not feel small. He felt like a ghost in a machine, wearing a charcoal hoodie and carrying a backpack that looked standard but contained a customized Raspberry Pi rig. Leo moved through the lobby with the practiced nonchalance of someone who belonged there. He had already cloned a security consultant's RFID badge while standing next to him at the coffee shop across the street. Julia had told him to stay in the hotel, but Leo was his mother's son. He didn't take orders when there was intelligence to be gathered. He wanted to see where the dragon lived. He wanted to see if the man his mother was trying to destroy was worth the effort. He bypassed the main security gates and slipped into the executive elevator bank, the gold-trimmed lifts that led straight to the heavens of the 88th floor. The doors to the executive lift slid shut with a silent, expensive hiss. Leo turned to find he wasn't alone. In the corner of the elevator stood a man who looked like he was made of shadow and grief. Kang Yoon-suk didn't look like a CEO at that moment. He looked like a prisoner. His suit was perfect, but his eyes were sunken, staring at the floor as if the weight of the building were pressing down on his shoulders. Yoon-suk didn't even look at the boy at first. He assumed it was the child of a high-ranking executive or a client. Leo, unfazed, pulled a specialized mechanical puzzle from his pocket, a K-ball consisting of intertwined titanium rings that required a specific mathematical sequence of rotations to unlock. It was a problem that had stumped doctoral students. As the elevator climbed, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic click-clack of the metal rings. Yoon-suk glanced down. His eyes caught the movement of the boy's hands. Then his breath hitched. The boy was tapping his right signet finger against his thumb in a 3-beat cadence between moves. Click-clack, tap, tap, tap. Yoon-suk felt a cold shiver race down his spine. It was his own habit, a nervous tic he had possessed since childhood, one he had never seen anyone else perform. "The third ring," Yoon-suk said, his voice raspy. "It's a prime number sequence. You're rotating it based on the golden ratio, aren't you?" Leo didn't look up, but his lips quirked into a tiny, confident smirk. "Close. It's actually based on the Collatz conjecture. If 1 and 1 is even, I divide by 2. If 1 and 1 is odd, I triple it and add 1. Leo made 3 rapid-fire adjustments. With a satisfying snap, the titanium ball fell apart into its component pieces. "Most people take 3 days to solve that," Yoon-suk whispered, leaning against the railing. "Who are you?" Leo finally looked up. Yoon-suk felt as though the elevator had suddenly plummeted 40 floors. Looking at the boy was like looking into a time-distorting mirror. The boy had the high, regal cheekbones of Julia Thompson, a heritage of strength and beauty. But the eyes? The eyes were a perfect, haunting replica of Eun-suk's own. The same slight tilt, the same deep obsidian intensity. "I'm Leo," the boy said, his voice steady. "I'm just here for the view." "Leo," Yunsuk repeated. The name felt heavy in his mouth. He looked at the boy's hair, the same stubborn cowlick at the temple that Yunsuk fought every morning. The elevator reached the 88th floor. The doors opened to a panoramic view of Seoul, the city spread out like a circuit board. "You shouldn't be up here, Leo," Yunsuk said, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't in a decade. It's dangerous for people who aren't prepared for the height." "I like the height," Leo said, stepping out of the lift. He paused and looked back at Yunsuk. "My mom says that if you're afraid of the height, you shouldn't build the mountain." The doors closed before Yunsuk could respond. Yunsuk stood in the empty elevator for a full minute after the boy disappeared. He touched his own signet finger, his hand trembling. Julia. He did the math. 10 years. The boy looked exactly 10 years old. He stumbled into his office, ignoring his secretary's frantic updates about the legal bombs Julia was dropping. He didn't care about the lawsuits. He didn't care about the hostile takeover. "Get me the security footage from the executive elevator," Yunsuk barked into his intercom. "Now!" He slumped into his leather chair. He had lied to save her life. He had broken her heart to keep her career intact. But as he stared at the grain of his mahogany desk, he realized the terrifying possibility. Julia hadn't left Seoul alone. "What have I done?" he whispered to the empty, opulent room. He wasn't just facing an executioner. He was facing the life he was never allowed to have. The deposition room was a sterile box of white light and cold glass, designed to make even the innocent feel like they were under a microscope. Julia Thompson sat at the head of the table, the court reporter staccato typing, providing the only heartbeat in the room. Across from her, Kang Eun-suk looked like a man prepared for his own execution. Beside him sat his longtime counsel, Attorney Park, a man whose face was a map of every secret the Kang family had ever buried. "Let the record reflect," Julia began, her voice a sharp blade cutting through the silence, "that we are establishing the fitness of Mr. Kang Eun-suk as the lead signatory for the Shinhwa/Hansung merger. Character Mr. Kang is a material asset in a billion-dollar deal." Yunsuk didn't blink. "Proceed." Julia leaned forward, the gold of her watch catching the light. 10 years ago, you were engaged to a high-ranking American attorney. The wedding was canceled 48 hours before the ceremony. Why? The air in the room thickened. Attorney Park shifted, but Eun-suk held up a hand to stop any objection. It was a private matter. "It was a matter of integrity," Julia countered, her eyes flashing with a decade's worth of suppressed fire. "Is it not true, Mr. Kang, that you were discovered in a hotel suite with a junior associate? Is it not true that while your fiancé was finalizing the legal framework for your company's expansion, you were occupied elsewhere?" Yoon-suk's jaw tightened so hard the bone looked ready to snap. The memory, the staged, horrific theater of it, rushed back to him. He remembered the smell of the hired woman's perfume, the way he had forced himself to look bored when Julia walked in, and the way Julia's world had shattered in her eyes. "It is true," Yoon-suk said, his voice a low, hollow rasp. "And you made no attempt to apologize? No attempt to explain? You simply let her walk out into the rain and never looked back?" "No attempt was made," he whispered. Julia's hands, hidden beneath the table, were shaking. She was using her own heartbreak as a legal cudgel, and it felt like pulling a serrated wire through her own skin. "So, you admit to a pattern of deceit? You admit that when a partner is no longer convenient for your bottom line, you discard them through betrayal?" "If that is how the council wishes to frame it," Yoon-suk said, looking directly into her eyes. He wanted to scream the truth. He wanted to tell her that his father had been holding a metaphorical gun to her head that night. But he took the hit. He became the villain she needed him to be to save her career 10 years ago. and he would be that villain again today. A man who betrays his bed will betray his board, Julia snapped, closing the file with a sound like a gunshot. We are done for today. The room cleared quickly. Julia stood by the window, her back to the door, trying to regulate her breathing. She felt a presence behind her. Miss Thompson? It was Attorney Park. He was alone. He looked at her with a peculiar, heavy sadness, the look of a man who had carried a burden for too long. Our side will be filing the rebuttal by morning, Park said formally. He held a thick manila envelope. I have some supplementary documents here regarding the original merger. If you could review them. Julia didn't turn around. Give it to my associate. He's already gone to the car, Park said, stepping closer. He didn't hand it to her. Instead, he slid the folder into her open briefcase, which sat on the table. It's highly confidential, Miss Thompson. I shouldn't be giving this to you. Consider it an error of an aging man. He bowed deeply, too deeply for a rival attorney, and hurried out of the room. The silence of the Grand Hyatt suite was absolute, the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm. Julia sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her tablet glowing with a cold, pale light. She had expected to find evidence of offshore accounts or signed bribes. She had expected to find the final nail in Yoon-suk's professional box. Instead, she found a folder labeled simply with a date, January 14th, 2016, the day her life had ended. Her finger trembled as she tapped the file. A grainy black and white surveillance feed flickered to life. It was the interior of Suite 702, the room where she had found him. Julia watched the screen, her breath hitching. On the video, the other woman was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed checking her watch. She looked bored. Then the door opened. Yoon-suk walked in. He looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. There was no dialogue, just the eerie silence of the footage. She saw him hand the woman a thick envelope. He gestured toward the bed, giving her instructions with the stiff, robotic movements of a man in shock. No, Julia whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Then, the video showed the moment Julia herself had burst into the room. On the screen, she saw her younger self, vibrant, happy, carrying a bag of takeout and a heart full of dreams, frozen in the doorway. She saw the younger Yoon-suk lean back against the headboard, his face a mask of practiced indifference, as the woman draped an arm over his shoulder. The Julia on the screen dropped the food and fled. The moment the door slammed shut, the Yoon-suk on the screen changed. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. He didn't stay in the bed. He didn't touch the woman. He practically threw her off him, pointing toward the door with a ferocity that made the woman scramble to grab her things and leave. Once the room was empty, the man Julia had spent 10 years hating fell apart. He didn't just sit down. His knees gave out. He slumped onto the carpet, his head hitting the edge of the nightstand. He stayed there for a long time, his shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs that seemed to pull the air out of the room. Then, he reached into his inner suit pocket. He pulled out a crumpled physical photograph, a picture of Julia laughing at a street food stall in Myeongdong. He clutched the photo to his chest, curling into a fetal position on the floor of the room where he had just destroyed his own soul. He stayed there. The timestamp on the video ticked forward. 1 hour, 2 hours, 4. He never moved. He just held her picture as if it were the only thing keeping him from drifting off the face of the earth. Then, Julia saw the second document in the folder, a directive from the chairman's office. Subject, Julia Thompson. If the relationship is not terminated by 2400, proceed with the civil ruin protocol. Ensure all bar associations are notified of the fabricated embezzlement charges. Notify immigration of the visa fraud. Silence her. He hadn't cheated. He had performed a public execution of his own happiness to save her from his father's darkness. He had let her hate him for 10 years so she could keep her life. Unsak, she whispered into the dark, the name no longer ash, but a wildfire. Julia's tablet slipped from her fingers, thudding onto the carpet. The air in the suite felt thin, oxygen deprived. The executioner was gone. In her place was a woman whose entire foundation had just turned to sand. Every lawsuit she had filed, every legal bomb she had planted, every ounce of venom she had nurtured for a decade, it had all been aimed at a man who had sacrificed himself to keep her from being destroyed by a monster. "You idiot!" she choked out, the tears finally breaking through the ice she had spent 10 years freezing. "You arrogant, noble idiot." She thought of Leo, sleeping in the next room. She thought of the 10 years of birthdays, first steps, and scraped knees that Yunsuk had missed because he thought he was saving her. She stood up, her legs wobbly. She looked out at the lights of the Xinhua building in the distance. She had come to Seoul to burn it down. But as she watched the flickering light of the tablet on the floor, showing the man she loved broken and alone in the dark, Julia Thompson realized her mission had changed. She wasn't going to destroy Yunsuk. She was going to destroy the people who had forced him to kneel. The drive to Yunsuk's private villa in Seongbukdong was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked asphalt. Julia drove herself, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She didn't want an audience. She didn't want a legal team. She wanted blood, or the truth, or perhaps just to scream until her lungs gave out. The villa was a brutalist masterpiece of concrete and glass, hidden behind high stone walls. When the gates opened, Yunsuk had clearly instructed security to let her in at any hour. Julia didn't wait for a valet. She stormed through the heavy oak doors, her heels echoing like gunfire against the marble. Yunsuk was in the library. He didn't turn around when she entered. He was standing by a fireplace that wasn't lit, staring at a painting of a storm-tossed sea. "You're a coward, Kang Yunsuk," Julia said, her voice trembling with a rage so cold it felt like ice. He turned slowly. He looked older than he had that morning. The shadows under his eyes were deep pits of exhaustion. "Julia, I assume you watched the files." "I watched a man destroy his life for a performance," she spat, walking toward him until she was inches away. She threw the digital drive onto his desk. "I watched you pay a woman to ruin me. I spent 10 years building a life out of the ashes you left behind. I hated you. Every morning I woke up. I used my hatred for you as fuel to become the woman who could come back and break you." "It worked," he said quietly. "You're the most powerful attorney I've ever met. Is that what you want? A thank you?" She shoved his shoulder, a sudden, violent burst of emotion. "You took 10 years from me. You took my choice. You decided, in your infinite, arrogant wisdom, that I wasn't strong enough to stand by you." "You weren't!" Yunsuk roared, his composure finally snapping. The sound was a physical blow, vibrating through the room. He grabbed her arms, his grip desperate. "You think this was about your career, Julia? You think I cared about you being disbarred?" "Then what?" she screamed back. "What could possibly be worth that kind of lie?" "A hitman!" The silence that followed was deafening. Yunsuk let go of her arms, his hands shaking as he turned away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "My father. He didn't just want you gone from the firm," Yunsuk whispered, his voice cracking. "He had a man stationed at the airport. He had a man following your taxi that night. The deal wasn't leave him and keep your job. The deal was leave him or you don't make it to the gate. He told me that if I didn't make you hate me, if I didn't make it so you never wanted to see my face again, he would make sure you never saw anyone's face again." Julia felt the floor tilt. The room seemed to shrink. You were saving my life?" "I was saving the only thing that mattered," he said, turning back to her. Tears were streaming down his face, unbidden and unchecked. I had to be the villain. If I had told you the truth, you would have stayed to fight him, and he would have killed you, Julia. I watched him do it to others. I couldn't let you be a martyr for a love he was going to stomp out anyway. The rage in Julia's chest didn't vanish. It transformed. It became a crushing, agonizing grief for the decade they had lost to a monster's shadow. She moved before she could think. She stepped into his space and gripped the lapels of his suit, burying her face in his chest. A low, keening sound escaped her, a sob that had been 10 years in the making. Yoon-suk wrapped his arms around her, pulling her so tight it was hard to breathe, his face pressed into her hair. I'm sorry, he sobbed into her neck. I'm so sorry, Julia. They stood there in the center of the dark library, two 55-year-old titans of industry, broken and bleeding out from old wounds. It was a reunion, but it wasn't a happy one. It was a funeral for the years that were gone. After a long time, Julia pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her legal mind, the one that never truly slept, was already calculating. The chairman was still alive. The threat was still real. He's still going to pay for this, Julia said, her voice regaining its executioner edge. He's dying, Julia, Eun-suk said weakly. The old man hasn't long left. Not fast enough, she countered. She looked at Yoon-suk, at the man who had lived a lie for 3,000 days to keep her breathing. Part of her wanted to scream the truth right then. You have a son. He has your eyes. He's 3 miles away at the Hyatt. But she looked at the security cameras in the corners of the room. She thought of the shadow fixer Min-hee had hired. If she told Eun-suk now, he would become impulsive. He would be vulnerable. And if the chairman found out he had a grandson, an heir he could mold or kidnap, Leo would be the new target. I have to go, Julia said, stepping back into the shadows. Julia, wait. Not yet, Eun-suk. She straightened her suit, the mask sliding back into place. We aren't safe yet. And until we are, there are things you still can't know. She turned and walked out, leaving him standing in the middle of his gilded cage. She had her answer, but the weight of the secret she was carrying, the 10-year-old secret named Leo, felt heavier than ever. The polished floors of the Seoul National University Hospital reflected the flickering fluorescent lights like a frozen lake. Julia Thompson, the woman who had stared down billion-dollar conglomerates without blinking, was currently leaning against a whitewashed wall, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The call had come 30 minutes ago. Leo had been out in the park with his nanny when a delivery scooter had swerved onto the sidewalk. It was a minor accident, a broken leg, and a deep laceration on his thigh. But the blood loss was significant. Miss Thompson? The doctor, a weary-looking man in his late 50s, approached her. The orthopedic surgery to reset the bone went well, but we have a complication. Your son has a very rare blood phenotype. Cis-AB. It's a rare genetic mutation found almost exclusively in a small percentage of the Korean population. Julia felt the world tilt. She knew what Cis-AB was. She had researched it the moment she realized she was pregnant 10 years ago. It was the reason she had been so careful. We don't have enough in the bank, the doctor continued, his voice dropping. And because it's a rare subtype, standard O-negative won't work for him without a high risk of a reaction. We need a direct donor. Are you? I'm O-positive, Julia whispered, her voice cracking. I'm not a match. And the father? Julia closed her eyes. The secret she had guarded like a crown jewel was suddenly a death sentence. To call Eun-suk was to bring him into the line of fire. To not call him was to risk Leo's life. 20 yards away, standing near the vending machines in a nondescript trench coat, Kang Eun-suk watched her. He had been following her for 3 days, not to spy, but to protect. His father's shadow fixers were still active, and Unsok knew that Julia's aggressive legal maneuvers had made her a target. He had seen the ambulance arrive at the Hyatt. He had followed it with his heart in his throat, fearing the chairman had finally struck at her. He saw Julia collapse into a plastic chair, her head in her hands. He had never seen her look so small. Unsok stepped out of the shadows. He didn't care about the risk anymore. He didn't care about the executioner mask. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy. "Julia," he said softly. She bolted upright, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. "Unsok? What are you—" "I've been watching over you," he said, his voice steady. "What happened? Is it the boy? The one from the elevator?" Julia couldn't lie. Not now. Not with the scent of antiseptic and fear clogging her throat. "He needs blood. A rare type. Cis AB. They don't have it, Unsok. I can't. I'm not—" Unsok's entire body went still. Cis AB. It was his blood type. The same rare, cursed phenotype that his father had used to prove Unsok was his true biological heir during a probate battle decades ago. He didn't say a word. He walked past Julia, heading straight for the nursing station. Julia tried to grab his arm, but he was a man possessed. He grabbed a clipboard from the counter, Leo's medical chart, and began to read. Patient name, Leo Thompson. Date of birth, September 17th, 2016. Blood type, Cis AB. Unsok's eyes traveled to the date of birth. He did the math in a heartbeat. October. 9 months after that rain-soaked night in Seoul, when he had broken her heart to save her life. The paper in his hand rattled. The room seemed to expand and contract. He looked through the glass window of the recovery room. There, lying on the bed with a cast on his leg and a bandage on his head, was the boy who solved the Collatz conjecture in an elevator. The boy with the 3-beat finger tap. My son. The realization wasn't a spark. It was an explosion. It leveled every defense he had built. It turned his 10 years of noble sacrifice into a tragedy of errors. Unsok, listen to me, Julia said, reaching him, her voice a frantic whisper. I was going to tell you, but then I saw you in bed with the woman. I was heartbroken and devastated. Unsok turned to her. His face was a mask of agonizing realization. 10 years, Julia? He's 10 years old? Unsok looked back at the boy. Then he looked at the nurse. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He simply rolled up his sleeve, exposing an arm that had once been held by Julia in love and was now ready to bleed for a son he didn't know he had. I am Cis AB, Unsok said to the nurse, his voice vibrating with a terrifying new authority. Take whatever he needs. Take it all if you have to. He looked at Julia, his eyes burning with a mix of fierce love and a new dark resolve. You kept him hidden. But now... He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Now that I know he exists, Julia, my father isn't the one they should be afraid of. I'm going to end this. I'm going to finish what we started 10 years ago, and then I'm going to be his father. As the needle entered Unsok's arm and his blood began to flow into the bag that would save Leo, Mr. Beck, the shadow fixer, lowered his long lens camera. He had the photo, the CEO, and the American lawyer at the pediatric ICU. The secret was no longer a secret. The war had just moved from the boardroom to the bloodline. The hospital room was bathed in the blue-gold twilight of a Seoul evening. Leo slept, his breathing rhythmic and steady, thanks to the blood now pumping through his veins. Blood that was a perfect genetic match to the man sitting in the plastic chair beside him. Unsok looked gray. The transfusion had taken a physical toll, but it was the psychic weight that was crushing him. He looked at his son, and then at Julia, who stood by the window, silhouetted against the city she had come to reclaim. 10 years, Yoon-sok said, his voice a ghost of a sound. I missed 10 years of his life because you didn't think I deserved to know? Julia turned, her face a mask of weary iron. Deserve? We're talking about deserve now, Yoon-sok? You forfeited your right to deserve anything the moment you staged that theater in the hotel. You wanted me to believe you were a monster. I believed you. I did exactly what you wanted. I left, and I never looked back. I did it to keep you alive. Yoon-sok stood up, his legs shaking from the blood loss. I thought if you stayed, my father would kill you. I chose your life over our love. But this? Keeping a child from his father? That isn't protection, Julia. That's vengeance. Julia stepped into the light, her eyes blazing. This wasn't the executioner anymore. This was a mother who had survived the trenches. Vengeance? You think I did this for revenge? I was 45 years old, Yoon-sok. I was alone in a country that didn't feel like home anymore, working 80-hour weeks to build a career that you supposedly saved for me. I spent my nights sick with morning vent, crying over a man I thought had traded me in for a younger model. I raised a Black Korean boy in a world that wasn't ready for him, answering questions about a father who I thought didn't want him. She walked right up to him, poking a finger into his chest. You sent me away. You let me raise a child alone because you were too arrogant to think I could fight beside you. You made yourself a martyr and left me to be a single mother. Don't you dare talk to me about what I should have done. I did the only thing I could. I survived. Yoon-sok flinched as if she'd slapped him. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that in his quest to be her savior, he had become her greatest hardship. While the storm raged in the hospital, a different kind of darkness was settling over the Kang family estate. Chairman Kang Seong-ho sat in his darkened study, staring at a high-resolution photo on his desk. It was the photo Mr. Beck had taken an hour ago. Yoon-sok, Julia, and the boy. The resemblance was undeniable. The cis-AB blood type confirmation from the hospital's internal server, hacked minutes ago, was the final piece of the puzzle. The chairman didn't look angry. He looked satisfied. A genius, the chairman mused, tracing Leo's face in the photo. Eun-sok's intellect, the woman's fire, and the cis-AB bloodline preserved. It's a miracle. The merger is failing, Chairman, Mr. Beck whispered from the shadows. The board is turning against Yoon-sok because of Miss Thompson's lawsuits. Let the merger burn, the chairman snapped, his eyes narrowing. Yoon-sok has become weak. He's obsessed with this woman, but the boy is a blank slate. He is the perfect heir to the Xinhua legacy. If we cannot control the father, we will mold the son. What are your orders, sir? The chairman stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. Wait until they leave the hospital. When they think they are safe, when they think the truth has set them free, bring my grandson home. Use whatever force is necessary. If the mother interferes, handle her, permanently this time. The sirens of Seoul were a distant hum compared to the roar of blood in Julia's ears. She stood at the hospital window, her eyes narrowing, as 3 black SUVs ignored the no parking signs and swerved into the emergency bay. They're here, she said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, cold steel. Yoon-sok was at the bedside, his hand hovering over Leo's small, bandaged one. He looked at the security monitors, the same ones Leo had bypassed earlier. He saw the men in gray suits stepping out. He recognized the lead man, Mr. Beck. My father doesn't do things by halves, Yoon-sok said, his face hardening into a mask Julia hadn't seen in a decade. It was the face of the man who had built an empire. He's not here for a conversation. He's here for the air. Julia turned, her blazer discarded, her silk sleeves rolled up. He's about to find out that I don't just sue people, Eun-sok. I erase them. But I can't do it alone. Not in this city. Yoon-sok stood up, the IV bruise on his arm, a badge of his new allegiance. What do you need? I need your access codes to the Xinhua internal server, and I need you to call an emergency board meeting for 6 a.m., Julia said, her fingers already flying across her encrypted laptop. You handle the board. I'll handle the bank. We stop playing defense. We go for the throat. Yoon-sok looked at her, the woman he'd broken, who had returned as a goddess of retribution. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. The power couple of the century. 10 years late, but right on time. The war room. 3 a.m. They didn't go to the villa. They went to a black site office Julia kept in Gangnam, a minimalist glass box filled with servers and high-end security. Leo was asleep in the back room, guarded by Julia's private security detail, flown in from New York. The chairman's power is rooted in the Seong-ho Foundation, Julia explained, tapping a key that brought up a complex web of offshore accounts. It's his personal piggy bank. If I can prove he used foundation funds to pay for private security, meaning hitmen and kidnappers, I can trigger a global asset freeze under the anti-corruption statutes. And while you're freezing his heart, I'll be taking his crown, Yoon-sok added. He was on his second phone, speaking in rapid-fire Korean to board members who had been loyal to his father for 40 years. I'm not asking them to join me. I'm telling them the ship is sinking, and I'm the only one with a lifeboat. They worked in a synchronized rhythm that felt like they had never been apart. She would find a legal loophole. He would provide the corporate leverage. It was a dance of two masters. At one point, their hands brushed over a tablet. They both froze. The air between them crackled with 10 years of unsaid things. But Julia pulled back first. Win the war first, Yoon-seok, she whispered. Then we talk about us. The coup. 6 a.m. The Xinhua boardroom was silent as a tomb. The chairman sat at the head of the table, his cane resting against the mahogany. He expected a surrender. He expected Eun-sok to walk in and hand over the boy in exchange for the company. The doors swung open. Yoon-sok walked in, but he wasn't alone. Julia Thompson walked 2 steps behind him, carrying a briefcase that looked like a weapon. Father, Yoon-sok said, his voice echoing, You're in my seat. You dare bring this woman back into this room? The chairman hissed, his eyes like flint. You think a few lawsuits can stop me from taking what is mine? That boy is a king. That boy is mine. Julia stepped forward, her voice a whip crack. She slid a document across the table, and as of 4 minutes ago, the Seoul Central District Court has granted an emergency injunction freezing all personal and foundation assets belonging to Kang Seong-ho. You are currently penniless, Chairman. You can't even pay the men waiting in the lobby. The chairman's face turned a sickly shade of purple. He looked at the board members. Do something! Fire him! One by one, the board members looked away. The board has already voted, Father, Eun-sok said, leaning over the table, his face inches from the old man's. We've moved the company to a decentralized structure. Your voting shares, voided, due to the criminal investigation into the shadow fixers you've been employing. You're not a chairman anymore. You're just a man with a very expensive cane and no way to pay for your defense. As security led the sputtering chairman out of the building, Julia and Yoon-sok stood alone in the massive boardroom. The sun was rising over Seoul, turning the sky a bruised purple and gold. It's done, Julia said, the adrenaline finally leaving her. She felt like she could sleep for a year. It's just beginning, Yoon-sok corrected. He turned to her, the morning light catching the silver at his temples. We saved the company. We saved Leo. But Julia? How do I save us? Julia looked at the city she had once fled in shame. She thought of Leo, the perfect bridge between their two worlds. You start by taking us to breakfast, she said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. And then you spend the next 10 years making up for the last 10. Yoon-sok reached out, and this time Julia didn't pull away. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that had fought so hard for them both. I think I can manage that, he whispered. The Seoul Central District Court was surrounded by a sea of satellite trucks and picketers. The trial of the century had moved beyond the boardroom and into the public consciousness. On the left side of the aisle sat the prosecution, backed by the remnants of the chairman's loyalists. Their goal was simple: destroy Yoon-suk's credibility by claiming he had embezzled billions of won 10 years ago to buy the silence of a disgruntled American lover. Julia Thompson. On the right sat Julia. She was dressed in a suit of ivory white, a stark, luminous contrast to the dark wood of the courtroom. She wasn't just Yoon-suk's defender. She was the star witness of a history being rewritten in real time. The prosecution claims my client, Mr. Kang Eun-sok, misused corporate funds, Julia said, standing and walking toward the center of the room. She didn't look at the judges. She looked directly into the camera lens, broadcasting her image to millions of homes across Asia. They claim these funds were a payoff, a bribe to hide a scandal. She paused, the silence in the room so heavy it felt pressurized. The truth is far more sinister, she continued, her voice low and dangerous. The money in question was never a payoff. It was a ransom paid by the chairman himself to prevent the extrajudicial ruin of an innocent woman. I would like to enter into evidence Exhibit 9 Alpha, Julia said. A giant screen lowered from the ceiling. The courtroom lights dimmed. Suddenly, the grainy black and white footage from 10 years ago, the footage Julia had discovered in the secret files, began to play. The public saw a younger Eun-seok, broken and weeping on a hotel floor. Then, Julia switched the feed. She showed the civil ruin protocol, a leaked internal document from the chairman's private server. Project: Black Swan Objective: eliminate Julia Thompson. Method: fabricated embezzlement charges, visa cancellation, and physical removal if necessary. The gallery gasped. The sound of camera shutters became a deafening roar. For 10 years, the public has been told that Shinhwa Holdings is a pillar of Korean tradition, Julia said, her voice rising with the decade of suppressed power. But this document proves it was a criminal enterprise run by a man who viewed human lives as disposable assets. My client didn't embezzle money for greed. He moved those funds into a protected trust to ensure that if the chairman ever carried out his threats, I would have the resources to survive. She turned to the chairman, who sat in the front row, his face a pale mask of shock. You didn't just try to break a relationship, Julia said, walking toward the old man until she was inches away. You tried to erase a human being, and in doing so, you created the very person who is going to dismantle your legacy today. The internet exploded. On social media, the hashtag The Seoul Protocol began trending globally. The narrative had shifted from a corporate scandal to a story of tragic sacrifice and a woman's righteous return. Yoon-sok was called to the stand. He didn't look at the lawyers. He looked only at Julia. Why did you stay silent for 10 years, Mr. Kang? The judge asked. Because I loved her more than I loved my own life, Yoon-sok said, his voice steady for the first time in years. And because I knew that as long as my father believed she was gone, she was safe. I accepted the role of the villain so she could be the hero of her own story. The courtroom erupted. Even the stenographer was wiping away tears. Outside, the picketers changed their signs. The old guard was no longer respected. They were relics of a cruel patriarchal past. Julia returned to her seat. She felt a small hand slip into hers under the table. Leo, wearing a small suit and looking every bit the prince of a new era, squeezed her hand. The judge banged the gavel, but it was over. The prosecution's case had collapsed under the weight of the chairman's own cruelty. This court finds the charges against Kang Yoon-suk to be without merit, the judge declared. Furthermore, this court orders an immediate criminal investigation into the activities of Chairman Kang Seong-ho regarding extortion and conspiracy to commit harm. As the court adjourned, the chairman was swarmed, not by his assistants, but by police officers. Julia and Yoon Seok stood in the center of the chaos. For the first time in 10 years, the shadow was gone. They were in the light. "We did it," Eun-suk whispered. "No," Julia said, looking at Leo, who was staring up at his father with wide, proud eyes. "We're just getting started." The golden logo of Shinhwa Holdings was being lowered from the facade of the skyscraper by a massive crane. It was a silent, mechanical execution. Below, the streets of Seoul moved on, indifferent to the fall of a king. But for the man watching from the window of the 88th floor, it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. Kang Yoon-suk laid his resignation letter on the empty mahogany desk. There was no one left to give it to. The chairman was currently in a detention center awaiting trial, and the board had been reorganized into a transparent collective. "You're really doing it!" He turned. Julia Thompson stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored cashmere coat, her hair down for the first time since she had arrived. The executioner armor had been traded for something warm, something human. "The throne was a cage, Julia," Yoon-suk said, walking toward her. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man who had finally caught his breath after 10 years of drowning. "I've spent my life protecting a legacy that didn't love me back. I'm done being a relic. I want to build something that actually belongs to us." "The Seoul Protocol," Julia whispered, a playful glint in her eyes. "A boutique firm. Thompson and Kang. High stakes, high integrity. And a lot of time for family dinners," Eun-suk added, reaching out to take her hand. His grip was firm, no longer trembling. The air in Namsan Park was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant chime of the Seoul Tower's bells. The cherry blossoms were in their final, spectacular bloom, drifting through the air like pink snow. Leo walked between them, his leg cast replaced by a sturdy brace and a walking stick that he used with the dramatic flair of a young philosopher. He was talking animatedly about the neural network he was designing to track global environmental shifts, his hands moving in that familiar rapid-fire rhythm. Yoon-suk stopped at a stone overlook that viewed the entire city. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with a new kind of pride. "Wait a moment." The boy turned, his obsidian eyes, Yoon-suk's eyes, curious. Yoon-suk reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside sat the Kang signet ring. It was a heavy gold piece engraved with the family crest, worn smooth by 3 generations of CEOs. It was the ring Yoon-suk had tapped 1,000,000 times in anxiety while he sat in rooms full of liars. "This belonged to my grandfather and his father before him," Yoon-suk said, his voice steady. "In our family, it was always used as a symbol of power, of who gets to sit at the head of the table." He took Leo's hand and pressed the ring into his palm. "But I want you to keep it for a different reason," Yoon-suk continued. "Keep it as a reminder that your name doesn't define your destiny. You are a Thompson and a Kang. You are the best of 2 worlds. Don't use this to rule, Leo. Use it to remember that you are never alone." Leo looked at the ring, then up at the father he had only known for a few weeks, but had waited for his whole life. He didn't put it on. It was too big for his finger. But he tucked it securely into his pocket and hugged Yoon-suk's waist. "I'll keep it safe, Dad," Leo whispered. Julia stood a few feet away, watching the scene. The wind caught her hair, swirling the cherry blossoms around her like a halo. For 10 years, she had been a woman of war. She had sharpened her mind into a blade and her heart into a shield. She had won the lawsuits, she had frozen the assets, and she had dismantled the dynasty that tried to erase her. She had won it all: the money, the reputation, the revenge. But as she watched Yoon-suk lift Leo up so the boy could see the mountains in the distance, Julia realized those weren't the victories that mattered. She wasn't the executioner anymore. She wasn't the girl who ran away in the rain. She was a woman who had fought for her truth and found her way back to the only person who truly saw her. Yoon-suk looked back at her over his shoulder, his eyes searching hers, asking a silent question about their future. Julia didn't answer with words. She simply stepped forward, joining them at the railing. She leaned her head on Yoon-suk's shoulder and felt the warmth of his arm wrap around her. She looked out at the city of Seoul, the city that had broken her, and the city that had now given her everything. And then, Julia Thompson did something the legal world thought she was incapable of. She smiled, a wide, brilliant, soul-deep smile that reached her eyes and stayed there. The Seoul Protocol was complete. The past was paid for. The future was theirs. The skyline of Seoul has changed, but the most significant shift isn't in the architecture. It's in the power structure. The name Xinhua is a footnote in history books, replaced by the global gold standard of legal and corporate ethics, Thompson and Kang International. 5 years later, the Glass Tower. The top floor of the Thompson and Kang building didn't look like a traditional law firm. It felt like a sanctuary. There were no dark woods or dusty law books. Instead, there was floor-to-ceiling glass, living green walls, and the quiet hum of a firm that didn't need to shout to be heard. Julia Thompson, now 60, stood at the head of the conference table. If the world thought she would soften with age, they were wrong. Her hair was a striking, natural silver-white curls, and her suit was a sharp emerald velvet. She looked like a queen who had finally found her kingdom. "The settlement is non-negotiable," Julia said, sliding a tablet toward the trembling CEO of a tech giant accused of labor exploitation. "You pay the families, you restructure the board, or I spend the next 3 years making sure your brand name becomes a synonym for obsolete. My husband handles the corporate side, and I handle the carnage. Choose your exit." The CEO looked at the man sitting next to Julia. Kang Yoon-suk looked younger at 60 than he had at 45. The crushing weight of his father's legacy was gone, replaced by a calm, lethal confidence. He leaned back, his hand resting casually on the back of Julia's chair, a silent, constant support. "I'd listen to her," Yoon-suk said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. "I've seen what happens when she gets bored. It's much more expensive." The CEO signed. The heavy glass doors to the office swung open one afternoon, and a teenager, nearly 6 feet tall with a lean, athletic build and sharp, intelligent eyes, walked in. Leo was 15, and he was the personification of a global future. He was wearing a hoodie from a prestigious robotics competition and carrying a trophy that looked suspiciously like it had been 3D printed from titanium. "Mom, Dad," Leo said, his voice dropping into a deeper register. "I won, but the judges think I cheated on the final algorithm because no human could compute it that fast." Julia laughed, a warm, rich sound that echoed through the glass office. She walked over and pulled her son into a hug. "Tell them to call your mother. I have a very specific set of skills for people who question my son's brilliance." Yoon-suk stood up and ruffled Leo's hair, his eyes shining with a pride that the old chairman could never have understood. "Or just show them the signet ring, Leo. Tell them it's a family heirloom for people who think 10 steps ahead." Leo pulled the ring out from under his hoodie. He wore it on a sturdy platinum chain around his neck. It was a symbol of where he came from, but more importantly, a reminder of the parents who had burned down a dynasty to give him a choice. That evening, Julia and Yoon-seok stood on the balcony of their private residence, overlooking the Han River. Do you ever regret it? Julia asked, leaning back against Yoon-seok's chest. Stepping down? Giving up the empire? Yoon-seok wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. The city lights twinkled below them, no longer looking like a battlefield, but like a playground. I didn't give up an empire, Julia, he whispered into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. I traded a crown of thorns for a life of peace. I traded a title for a son, and I traded a hollow marriage for the only woman who ever made me feel like I was worth saving. He turned her around, his hands cupping her face. The love in his eyes was no longer a secret. It was a manifesto. We are the Soul Protocol, Julia. We protect what's real. Julia smiled. The smile of a woman who hadn't just survived the game, but had rewritten the rules entirely. She kissed him, a slow, lingering promise that the next 10 years would be even better than the last. The executioner and the tragic CEO were gone. In their place stood a legacy built on truth, a love that had survived a decade of silence, and a family that was finally, irrevocably, whole. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.